Hi, it's Cara Brown, and this is Watercolor Conversations. It's a place where I share my love of watercolor and my seeking, my teaching, my discoveries, the connections I see, and just in general what it's like to be alive at this time here on planet Earth. I hope that this meets a part of you that's longing to be met. Thanks for being here. Hi, it's Cara, and I have a little bit of a different podcast episode for you today. It's informational. It's instructive. I'm going to talk about where we start, or where I think is a great place to start anyway in our watercolor journey, and that is with the stuff that we work with, the paint. Over the years of my leading watercolor groups and workshops, I've noticed that artists come into the studio with lots of paints, Ziploc bags and plastic storage containers and all shapes and sizes, pans in trays. When faced with deciding what paint to choose to make a particular part of their painting, like which yellow when they're going to paint a sunflower, when they look at the tubes, the names of them and the manufacturer's little bit of color, they find hardly useful. And they are hardly useful until you really know what's inside that tube of paint anyway. You need to know on another level in order to fully choose your paints without doing trial and error every time. I offer a color workshop, in fact, a couple of them, but my first color workshop I called Get Intimate with Color. And sometimes I make things up. I use words that are sort of odd, sort of funny, and I get a little sort of bashful about it. As I did when I first named this workshop, Get Intimate with Color. But then I realized that there was a certain genius to it, she says, because it's exactly what we do in this workshop. We get intimate with it. We are focusing our attention like we would on someone we really care about, that we wanted to be intimate with, and we notice the qualities and the behaviors of the paints when we mix it with water and put it on paper. So this is where we start. Putting paint on paper is called swatching it, SWATCH, swatching paints. And it's become way more commonplace than it was 30 years ago when I first started painting in watercolor. At least in the online world, people are always talking about it, referring to swatching paints. But it's still not universal. It's not something that everyone automatically does. And so I preach it. I say, how can you know what's in that tube until you squeeze it out, or at least dab your brush into the open end of it with a little water and spread it around on some watercolor paper to see what it does? I mean, what color it is, what consistency. Sometimes paints are gummy. Sometimes they're gummy because the binder, which is the substance that gets mixed with the powder pigments that creates the paint, they can get separated from the pigment itself, and you squeeze it out and it looks weird. And people say, what's wrong with this paint? It seems oily, but it's not. It's more gooey. It's like syrup. But then there's paints like cobalt violet. It's always gummy. It's a very unique color, this lovely reddish violet that's kind of light, and it looks like it would be really pretty to paint flowers with, but it is gooey when you paint it out. Even when you add water to it, it is funky, at least for me. Maybe some people are really in love with this color and they don't like what I'm saying here, but I kind of like my paints to have juicy, rich color, and cobalt violet is odd. I think it maybe has something to do with the size of the pigment particles of the powdered pigment that we get cobalt violet from, but it is a different experience, and you will never know that until you squeeze it out and play with it on your paper. So it's the number one thing to do when you get a new tube of paint, and that is to swatch it. What does that mean? At the very basic level, it's taking it out, opening up the tube, and if it's a pan, then you reconstitute some of that pigment and binder onto your brush, and you put it onto some paper. And then there's the other part, which is super important, and that's labeling it. I can't tell you how many lovely little bits of watercolor paper I have with some kind of paint on it. I can venture a guess, but I don't know exactly which one it is unless I put a minimum amount of information down next to that swatch of color. For me, that is the brand, because I do have paints from different companies, and the name of the paint, but I also put the pigment code down. And I'm not going to get into what that is, but trust me that pretty much all reputable, as in not really inexpensive sets of paints have pigment information on them, and they all start with a P, or almost all start with a P. For example, one of my favorite pigments in the world is PR122. It's a bluish red-violet. In Daniel Smith, they call it quinacridone lilac. In Core, that's QOR Core, they call it quinacridone magenta. And my favorite, my preference, is Sennelier's version, which they call Helios purple. I find it the most vivid and lovely, so it's my preference, but the others are nice paints as well. Knowing that is what's here on this piece of paper is really helpful. Well, it's imperative rather, it's not just helpful. Otherwise, it's just a swatch of color. It's not useful. The experience of doing it was there, but then as a reference tool, you're nowhere. A number of years ago when I was teaching my color workshop, someone came in with an idea they got from Brenda Swenson, who's another artist. She's much more well-known than I am. And she's also a teacher, and she recommended using these 8.5 by 11 sheets that have 3 holes in them so they can go in a 3-ring binder, and they're used by hobbyists for stamps and slides and coins. They have little 2x2 pockets in them that you can slip 2x2 pieces of watercolor paper in, and that's how I store my swatches. I call that collection of swatches, these pages of sheets, like I have a sheet for yellows and a sheet for oranges or orange reds and a sheet for kind of violet red, etc. And I call this collection of swatches my inventory. It's what I own, and everything I own is there. And even some things that I don't own anymore, like I used to, and I used it up and I haven't replaced it, so that I have a full library of colors that have passed through my watercolor life. If I get a new yellow or a new earth tone or a new pinky red, I paint a new swatch, and then I can feed it in with the others that are similar, so that I can keep comparing. Whereas if I do my inventory on one sheet of paper, it's a snapshot. It's a moment in time of these are my paints, and if I get something new, there's no way for me to squeeze it in there. So that's why I really like this method, and I'm very grateful to Brenda Swenson for teaching it and offering it as a suggestion that has come my way, which I then continue to carry on. I refer to my inventory all the time, mostly when I'm helping an artist student, but it's useful, so useful, to be able to compare paints of a particular color family, or to make combinations, and even to identify a random blob of paint on a palette. I paint a swatch of the mystery blob, I let it dry, and then I compare and see what it looks like. It's great for that. And if it's nothing that's in my inventory, if it's drastically different than everything, then it's still a mystery, but at least I know that it's not anything that I already own. There are a bunch of qualities that the paints have that you can keep your eye out for when you are swatching. I already talked a little bit about the gumminess that some paints can have. Another quality is how active it is. If you wet the paper first and then you touch a brush with a little bit of the paint, and it can either just stay where your brush is on the paper in the water, or it can fly across that wet passage on your paper. And this depends upon how much dispersant, which is an ingredient in paints, that the manufacturer put in the paint, or it can just be the quality of the paint. But you can really see the movement happen. And some paints move a lot more than others, and those paints can be a little pushy when they are in solution on your paper with another paint. So it's something that you can observe. So you can put that in your memory bank. This one does that. You can observe whether or not it's transparent or somewhat opaque. It has a kind of density to it, whether it obscures the paper and anything underneath it. You can see whether it's clear, which is another way of saying transparent. Transparent generally means clear. Or granulating, so that you can see that there's little particles of pigment, and if you're painting on paper that has some kind of texture, it'll settle in the little valleys of the paper. So this is where that attention thing comes in again, that thing we pay as if it's a limited resource. We pay our attention as we paint to notice these things. You can make notes about it if you want, or you can just have the observation to be an experience and something that you might be able to recall later. Oh yeah, I remember when I was swatching that. That thing was kind of granulating. What do I do when I make an inventory? If I have a bunch of paints that I'm going to swatch all at one time, I take a ruler and I make 2-inch squares on 140-pound watercolor paper. I then set out my paints so that they're arranged by color as best I can. I take the cap off one at a time, and then I take my trusty little mechanical pencil and I make notes what paint this is and its pigment number, and if it's multiple pigment numbers, if it's a mixture, a recipe, then I often just put a star. If it's two, sometimes I put them both there. Like, for example, though I paint mostly with Daniel Smith paints, there is a Winsor Newton paint that I really love called Permanent Sap Green. And it's a combination of PG36, which is phthalo green yellow shade, and PY110, which is isoindoline yellow. So, which is kind of fun to know these things. You can mix it with those two pigments if you have those two pigments. It's really nice to have it consistent and mixed up for you all the time. This we call these things convenience mixtures, which there are a lot in the green family, but that's a whole nother episode, talk about greens. So then I take clean water and I paint a square of water within the 2 inches within the lines. And then I unscrew the cap of the paint, if I haven't already done that. And I just barely tap the tip of the damp brush in it. So I get a little tiny bit of paint on the tip of the brush. And this saves me from having to squeeze it out on the palette when I may not want to do that with every single thing that I own or every single thing that I've just bought. So with a little bit of paint that I sort of reconstituted or diluted in the water that's on the paper, and see if I can get a range of density. See if I can get so that there's a lot of paint in solution, not sticky and gummy, but thick enough so that it obscures or almost obscures the paper. And then I might need to rinse my brush a little bit so I can do this next part, but I stretch it out a little so that on another part of my square swatch, I can see how it looks when there's a lot more water and some of the paper shines through. Because there can be a really big range, especially with some of the super dark pigments like dioxazine violet or the phthalos, especially phthalo blue. Phthalo blue and what they call mass tone, which is the thickest it can be, is almost black. But then when you stretch it out with some water, it can be this really lovely, quite vivid, saturated turquoise. If you don't get the water in there, you don't know. So it's good to see the range as much as you can in 2 inches. That's it. Then you just move on, rinse your brush, change your water when you need to, and make a note of what you're painting as you go. Then, when they're all dry, I cut them out along the lines and I tuck them in the little pouches of my inventory sheets, the plastic sheets, and it's ready to go. I keep my sheets in a nifty zipper folder thing. I don't have them in a binder, which seems a little bulky for me to carry around. I even did a bunch of watercolor pencils, and I did some specialty paints I have, like iridescence and luminescence. So it's all there. I know what I have. And if you're not that ambitious, and if you're not into the plastic sheet thing, you could just draw lines, or not, on your paper and paint some clean water down and let it go. Make sure that you label, though. There was one person who really wanted to make an art project out of making her inventory. This was years ago. And in one column, they were like hot air balloons, and then the next column they were like water drops, and they're sort of interlocking. It was just lovely. I wish I took a picture of it, and maybe one of these days I'll reproduce it so that I can have a visual of it to share. But it was fun. Do with it what your artist's imagination wants, and I promise you it will be a useful tool. You'll be able to refer to it when you want to choose just the right yellowy orange or a green, because greens can be all over the map. You have it painted out, and you don't have to just look at the tubes and wonder. Also, when you're just getting started, it's a super useful exercise and a great way to practice with watercolor, which is a very low risk, low stakes, that the paint and the water and the paper and the brush, and there's always room for more of that kind of practice and play. There's no getting it wrong. And if you pay attention, you are one step closer to really knowing your paints, their hues, what they do, and what you do and don't like about all of that. So get intimate with your paints. That's what I suggest. They are the starting place for what we do when we make our paintings. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. I wish you all the best to this new year and happy painting. Take care. Bye-bye. Until next time.